Hello, everyone. My final project topic is on the Spanish influenza of 1918. The Spanish influenza was referred to as the Spanish flu for first being publicly reported in Spain. However, it was already being spread in the US and most of Europe across the war front. This flu was like none other seen before and had mutated from a strain of the H1N1 virus and wreaked havoc in battle operations and essentially halted the First World War. Its modern counterpart, the coronavirus, is also a deadly disease, and we can trace a lot of how we've responded to the disease to what the US was doing 100 years ago. Now, the CDC estimates that worldwide, the Spanish flu killed approximately 50 million people. The coronavirus has killed 6.25 million as of the most recent data. During the start of 1918, the US was very much involved in the Great War that was taking place overseas in Europe. Because most because of this, the US was trying to quickly train and arrange for soldiers to take to fight. The military bases across the country were packed with recruits from all 48 states at this time. The overcrowded camps would later become a breeding ground for the Spanish influenza. Not only was the country at war, but thanks to recent innovations in agriculture and transportation, the people of the country were more connected than ever. Cities had grown into epicenters, thus meaning that major populations of people were condensed into small areas, making the disease spread more rapidly. Now, racism was also a major component at this time of U.S. history for many immigrants and African Americans living in impoverished communities. They were affected at a much greater rate than white people. Now, for the origin of the Spanish influenza, it doesn't really have anything to do with Spain. In fact, the first reports of the disease can be traced back to Camp Houston in Kansas of March 4th, 1918. One of the camp's cooks suffered from a coughing fit and was confirmed to be the first case within the U.S. 3 weeks after displaying symptoms, about 1,000 soldiers were hospitalized and thousands more were affected yet unaware. The soldiers would go on to fight in the front lines in Europe and start to spread there. This would later be regarded as the first wave. In August of 1918 was the beginning of the second wave. This would cause a more deadly mutation, creating panic as the virus spread across the country. So we have this image from Ernest Noble, and we see a giant creature that's transparent in nature. It appears in a humanoid figure with bird-like features. It's whacking a person in the head who is relaxing peacefully in his chair. Now, what can we infer? We assume that the virus took many Americans by surprise, affecting them even in their own homes. This surprise can really be cemented uh, of how Americans felt betrayed by the government with a massive cover up of the disease during the war. This reminds me of the excerpt from Pale Horse, Pale Rider by Catherine Ann Porter, where the main protagonist is caught up in the pandemic and goes into a coma. And in her coma, she goes through a journey through her subconsciousness where she's basically trapped in her body and questions death, life, and her own emotions. The story reminds me much of Bo Burnham's Inside. Uh, that was a more recent telling of him and his descent into madness as he struggles to be alone with the pandemic. Both stories are a testament of how isolation and disease can affect someone's psyche. Now I want to go over some of the cultural trends at the time. The media at the time was severely limited as the freedom of the press and freedom of speech were suspended thanks to the Espionage and Sedition Acts. This was done for two major reasons: to keep the U.S. people morally invested in the war and to keep the enemy from getting any information that leaks out. This suppression of speech led to the public not knowing much about the prevalence of the Spanish influenza in the country. And on the war front, Elizabeth Autka, in reconsidering the 1918 Spanish influenza in the age of COVID, says that in countries heavily involved in the First World War, writing about the pandemic could seem disloyal, a distraction from the real story of the war, even though the pandemic globally killed far more people. Now, this goes to show how the media was heavily involved in public opinion and shaped people's values. Propaganda at this time was put into overdrive, and this basically started the uber patriotism that we see lasting today. From some of the articles of the time, we get a glimpse of the pandemic from their eyes. And in a short clipping I found from the pandemic, they talk about the number of infections in military camps all over the country. But one interesting bit of information is that the newspaper gives the notification of the response to the virus that bigger cities are taking. Now, the quote reads: "Saloons in the cities are ordered closed for an indefinite period. Troops in Fort Bliss were today ordered to take meals outdoors to avoid spreading Spanish influenza by gathering in enclosed mess halls." This action is eerily similar to the action taken during COVID times once it became an apparent problem, especially by different companies and restaurants. Now, the biggest obstacle in combating the Spanish influenza, I'm sorry, the pandemic was really challenging three major parts of the US at this time, and that was the mass interconnectivity, public hygiene, and the power of the media. Before the pandemic, there was no national public health organization that had the capacity to prepare and plan out how to deal with pandemics. The CDC would later be created and would be a prized achievement of how, out of the horrors of the pandemic, we create such a lasting organization. Now, the CDC would look to the failings and successes of the states as a stepping stone to understand how to fight viral diseases. As for public hygiene, cities were filthy and living conditions for the poor were far more wretched. Hand washing and daily showers, as access to water became more accessible, greatly improved living conditions for humans as they became more resilient to disease. For the most part, American history and public health, this is the first time that public health and access to medical help was on the forefront of politics. Now, the biggest obstacle in combating the influenza and COVID has been the media. Just like the propaganda that was spewed during the war, plenty of newspapers and articles have downplayed the effects of both diseases. Now, during COVID pandemic, rampant confusion and misinformation plagued the U.S., leading there to be far more infections and deaths than there needed to be. Now, how has the response to a modern pandemic changed? As I've stated before, a lot of the responses we've seen to COVID 19 originated during the Spanish influenza of 1918. The closing of non essential workplaces, outdoor dining, social distancing, face coverings, they were all a product of the pandemic. Some newer responses that we've created thanks to technology and a better understanding of diseases has been to implement testing sites. And a lot of testing sites are stationed all over and allow for a person to know within minutes whether or not they're infected or not. And another key feature of the pandemic now is contact tracing. Now, this type of information can help us better understand how the virus moves and how many people are infected. And with this, we can in turn help prevent mass pandemics like what we've seen today.